We are spoiled for choice these days when it comes to buying a new bike, and truth be told, there aren't really many bad bikes out there. But I found 4 bikes that definitely failed to catch on and are now deemed flops, and only one of the bikes still lives on in any sense. The other 3 you can no longer buy unless you scour the second-hand classified. And a reminder for us consumers and bike brands that not every game-changing innovation is a step in the right direction, and it proves that us consumers have the power to dictate which bikes succeed and which fail. To kick things off, I give you the Canyon Grail, the German company's first gravel bike launched back in 2018, as distinctive now as when it first launched, thanks to the handlebar. The hover handlebar, the double-decker handlebar, whatever you call it. The internet was not kind to the bike when it launched, with memes about the double-decker handlebar, and yeah, it never really got over that stigma that quickly attached to the bike around it being a bit of a joke. The idea behind the handlebar was to give a multiple hand position for when riding off-road and on the road, and give more vibration damping comfort with a top section that could flex and a more rigid position in the drops. So sort of the best of both worlds, giving that rigidity when you need it and a bit of comfort when you want it. And it sort of worked, but it was so jarring compared to any conventional handlebar that it took you a while to embrace the handlebar and get used to it. But most people couldn't get past the looks. When you're looking at a bike, you are taking into account how it looks, and we are all biased to how a bike looks. Looks are still a big part of why we choose one bike over another. And function has to be important, but form is still really critical to when we buy bikes. And while the handlebar did offer some benefits over a conventional handlebar, it wasn't a game-changing handlebar in terms of the performance it offered. The handlebar introduced other issues as well, like bike fit. So they brought in a reach and stack plus to account for the fact you don't have a normal stem and handlebar, so where do you measure from? So that was a bit of an issue for sizing, and also made it difficult to adjust the fit. So stem length, handlebar width as well, because it's not a normal handlebar, and you have to swap the whole handlebar out, which isn't an easy job at all. And then there's the issue of fitting accessories to it. So lights, computers, other accessories you might want for commuting and bike packing. And Canyon were quite slow to bring out mounts for different lights and computers and phones as well. So not easy to set up for the riding you were doing with the bike. So yeah, from a setup point of view, quite tricky. And then maintenance as well, removing the whole thing for headset bearing replacements. So yeah, bit of a challenge from that point of view. So ultimately it failed because people couldn't get past how it looked. Very jarring looks. And then the whole setup issue, the bike fit and adding accessories. And it just wasn't the simplicity most people want from a gravel bike. And it's no surprise they gave it a good few years. It had a good run for a few years in their lineup. But when the new Grail came out a few years later, they went back to a normal handlebar, which is very telling that while they gave lots of marketing talk about how good the handlebar was, that when it came to update it, they realized it wasn't the right direction. Maybe right at the time, but even that's a stretch of the imagination, I think. So when they launched a new Grail, it had a more conventional handlebar. That handlebar still had a few quirks, but nothing like as quirky as a hover double-decker handlebar. So yeah, they listened to the feedback, they saw the market wasn't really accepting of that handlebar, and they scrapped it for the new Grail. So yeah, let me know what you think of the Canyon Grail. Do you agree with my sentiment around the handlebar, and do you still own one? I still see people riding the Canyon Grail, so clearly lots of people like the handlebar and it works for them. So let me know your thoughts on that bike by dropping a comment down below. Next up is perhaps the most controversial bike of the last decade, if not the century, the 3T Strada, a bike definitely ahead of its time. It was an aerodynamic bike designed around 28mm wide tyres with a one bike only gearing setup, and a bike that just proved too much for most people to wrap their heads around. It was too much all at one time. But interesting how lots of the elements of the Strada have now found their way into more conventional bikes that we all take for granted. So in a way, it was ahead of its time. It was a trendsetter. But yeah, definitely a crystal ball moment for bike tech development. So it was an aero frame designed, optimized around a 28mm wide tyre, which back then was extremely wide. 23, 25 was normal back then, but 28 is now on the narrow end, as most people are going to 30 and 32 and beyond. And it was one bike only back when 11-speed group sets were normal, a long way before 12-speed and 13-speed arrived on the scene. So lots for people to get their head around. If it had been one thing, it might have been okay, but all the things together, it was too much. Now, sadly, most people judged the bike and dismissed it based on not actually having ridden the bike or even seen it in the flesh, just seeing the pictures on the internet. That's the world we live in these days. Now, I rode a bike when I was working at Road CC. I rode it and tested it, and I was very impressed. It was fast, it was smooth, the comfort was good, and the wide tyres back then were really the first evidence that wide tyres will become the new standard for dealing with rough roads that we all have to contend with. The only issue was the seat post clamp was a bit flaky, but they quickly resolved that, and the one-by gearing was flawed in certain scenarios. But the real nail in the coffin of the 3T Strada was sadly the whole debacle with the pro team, Aqua Sport Blue, who were sponsored by 3T, and they rode a bike and they had some success, but some of the pros were very outspoken about the bike basically not being suitable for their riding and racing. But back then the one-by gearing wasn't really in the right place for it to be working in the mountains, on the flat stages, compared to where we are now with 1x13 Explore, which is much better in terms of having one-by drivetrain. It can cope with the hills and the high-speed flat stuff. But back then, yeah, the gearing didn't really work. And sadly, unfortunately, the criticism from the pros really stuck in the forums on bike websites around the world, and it really got labelled very quickly as a bit of a joke, which is a real shame because, as I said earlier, when I rode a bike, it really impressed. Maybe less as a race bike for pros, but for us amateurs seeking a fast, smooth bike, it definitely delivered. So 3T Strada was a flop, was ahead of its time, had to deal with a lot of criticism from stuck in the past roadies who weren't ready for disc brakes, wide tyres and one-by gearing. But if you look at where bikes are now, and this year's Tour de France, we saw riders on aero bikes with 30mm wide tyres and one-by drivetrains. Everything that the 3T Strada introduced for the first time over 10 years ago. So funny how that bike was really criticised very heavily, but now lots of us are riding bikes that essentially owe a lot to the foundations sort of laid down by 3T Strada. So for me, really a case of ahead of time and a real danger for bike brands launching a product too soon and when consumers aren't ready, because consumers in some aspects of tech development embracing do move quite slowly. Some quite quickly. Wide tyres really surprised me how roads have embraced wide tyres, but disc brakes, that took years and years, and one-by and tubeless, hookless, loads of other innovations that consumers need time to get their heads around, like, and myself as well, not just saying you, myself included, need time to wrap our heads around and slowly come around to the idea of that new thing actually being better than the old thing we're giving up. While some of the bikes in today's video have not caught on, what has definitely caught on is this camera, the new X5, the latest 360 camera from Insta360, the sponsor of today's video. I've been using the camera in all my bike reviews here on Just Ride Bikes, and it's a powerhouse of a camera. 8K up to 30 frames per second, a new tougher replaceable lens, so peace of mind if you do scratch or damage the lens, and you can put a lens cover on there as well. Improved electronics and sensor gives amazing image quality in all conditions, from bright sunlight to low light conditions in the woods and dappled light. There's also a new wind guard for the microphone, cutting down wind noise loads and giving really clear, crispy audio. And the battery can last up to 208 minutes in the new endurance mode, so loads of runtime for your longest adventures. And the beauty of the 360 camera, and the reason I love it so much, is you capture every angle. Mount it on the handlebars, which I do a lot for racing or events, or on the chest cam, or on the selfie stick, and you capture every angle, forwards, backwards, sideways, and worry about composing the video when you get home via the smartphone app or the desktop app. And editing a video is super easy. Don't need any video editing skills at all. So unlike some of the bikes in this video, definitely not a gimmick and definitely here to stay. You can find out more at the link down below in the description of today's video and use my affiliate link to buy your own X5. Another bike that was probably ahead of its time was the Cannondale Slate, launched way back in 2015. This was Cannondale's first attempt at a sort of all-road gravel. This was a time before gravel had really been coined as a phrase, and all-road was being touted as a name for road bikes with increasingly wide tire clearance for doing a bit of dirt, like you might get in the US, Boulder, where you have that smooth dirt, champagne gravel, where a road bike slick tire is just fine. And it had lots going for it, but also lots going against it. And like the 3T Strada and the Canyon Grail with a handlebar, lots of things that people just found too jarring and weren't open-minded enough to accept what Cannondale were offering. And what they were offering was an aluminium frame using all their amazing CAD experience, designed around 650B wheels. So smaller wheels with a bigger 42mm wide tyre, give the same outside diameter as a 28mm wide tyre on a bigger 700C wheel. So more comfort and more cushioning from the bigger tyres. And then, which proved a step too far, the use of a lefty suspension fork. Cannondale, as we know, have been doing lefty forks for over 20 years on their mountain bikes, and they launched a road version, the Oliver, with 30mm travel. And the idea was to give just maximum comfort and more control and traction when riding off-road. So the big balloon tyres and the suspension give a really smooth ride. And it looked cool, I think, and it rode really well. I rode it and it was a really interesting bike. It rode like a normal road bike, like a Synapse endurance bike. The geometry was essentially the same. Yes, it had big balloon tyres, but the geometry was the same thanks to the smaller wheels. And the suspension worked well too. You had a lockout dial, so you can lock it out for road, pavement, and open up for dirt, gravel sections. But the theory around the smaller 650B wheels was sound, but there was no tyre choice. The lefty suspension fork was cool, but added weight and complexity. And 20 years after it first came out, people still can't get their heads around the lefty suspension fork. But really, the biggest issue working against a Slate when it came out all those years ago is it was misunderstood. Because cast your mind back 10 years, gravel wasn't really a thing. People were only just embracing wide tyres and starting to take their road bikes off-road, where you have sort of dirt, you can ride a slick tyre off-road. And it was a bit on the heavy side too, the lefty fork and the aluminium frame. And there was never a carbon version of a Slate to offer a lower weight. And they never offered a rigid version, which I think they could have done, to offer a more conventional looking bike for people who didn't want suspension. But fair play to a US company. They gave it a good few years. They had a good running for a few years, but ultimately it never really caught on. They didn't really expand the range, didn't give us a carbon version to offer a lower weight, higher end version of the bike. And a few years later, they came out with the Topstone, a much more conventional gravel bike with normal size wheels and a normal rigid fork. And yeah, the rest is history really. They now have newer versions of the Topstone. They still have a lefty version. They have the Kingpin rear suspension pivot thing going on as well. So, but yeah, Slate definitely had a moment. I still see people riding them as well. Let me know if you own one, if you still have it in a shed or you sold it, by dropping a comment down below. And finally, for a bike the pros didn't ask for and us amateur consumers definitely didn't ask for, the Pinarello Dogma FS. It was a bike designed for the brutal cobbles and Pavé or Paris-Roubaix and Tour Flanders, and had front and rear suspension. Now, full suspension road bikes are not a new thing at all. We've had these in the past. Back in the 90s, Bianchi did a full suspension bike, but every decade, an old idea is resurfaced, brought back to life with the latest technology and material science and engineering of the day. And that's definitely a case here. So not a new idea, but implemented with the latest technology. It's worth remembering back in 2019 or so when the bike came out, endurance bikes were being developed for the pros like Fabian Cancellara, Pete Sagan, to give them a smooth ride and reduce fatigue on the cobbles of the spring classics, because the race bikes had very small clearance back then. Now they use their normal road bikes, the Dogma F and the Specialized Tarmac SL8, because of clearance. But back then, the road bikes didn't have big clearance, So the endurance bikes were developed for the pros and really a case of race on Sunday, sell on Monday, and really led the development of endurance bikes like Synapse, the Domani and others. And wide tires are one area where more comfort could be achieved by going to a bigger rubber, but Pinarello thought suspension was a viable solution. So they had in the head tube, they had a spring and damper giving 20 millimeters of travel, essentially a modern version of the old Cannondale head shock from the 90s, if you remember that. And on the rear, a small suspension damper at the top of the seat stays, giving about 10 millimeters of travel. And inside the frame, there was a battery pack and a CPU, which could control the front and rear suspension and use gyroscopes and have a clever wizardry to turn the suspension off and on automatically. So when the rider's on the tarmac, it's all locked out and rigid and responsive like you want. And then on the coals, it would open up and give the rider a smooth ride. And in Pinarello testing, it reduced vibration coming through the bike to the rider by 42%, which is definitely very impressive indeed. But the riders didn't really embrace it. I don't think pros want comfort, but they want speed and stiffness more than comfort. And the pros didn't embrace it, and I think it was used once and then it disappeared. I've never seen one in the flesh, never ridden one myself, so I can't comment on how it rides. If you've ridden it, let me know by dropping a comment down below. But definitely a solution, not a solution looking for a problem, because it was a valid attempt at bringing suspension with the latest electronic technology to a road bike. But road bikes were developing fast at the point, and tyre clearance was getting wider and wider, and Pinarello eventually scrapped the bike. So really interesting bike, really interesting technology, and one that could have delivered a new product line for Pinarello if they had believed in it more. Because it's quite interesting how Specialized have done the Future Shock on their Roubaix and Diverge, and that's now in its third or fourth generation, and really pursued and believed and developed that technology in a way that Pinarello clearly gave up after probably spending a lot of money on that bike and not really pursuing it beyond a season that the team used it for one day off the calendar. So yeah, so an interesting bike. So those are 4 bikes that failed to catch on, 4 flops. A reminder for all of us that while there are lots of amazing bikes out there, that not every bike will succeed and be around in 5 years or 10 years time, because either it was ahead of its time, or just a bit of a gimmick or a bit of a joke, or just the market didn't want that bike. So let me know what you think of these 4 bikes, whether you agree with my opinions on these bikes, whether you own one. I'd love to hear from you especially. And if there are other bikes you would put in this category of interesting, but ultimately flops. So that's all today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the button down below, and I'll see you again very soon.